Hello, my name is Eric Follick. I'm a Platonist, contemplative, ascetic, and renunciant. I would like to read for you a little piece that I wrote. It's entitled a Platonist, quote, precept, unquote, or quote, vow, unquote, of voluntary monastic poverty. Actually, besides giving the quote about poverty, it also gives some other quotations about the Platonist philosopher Philosophos being an actual contemplative ascetic and renunciant. This was put together from a couple pieces of correspondence I had with another Platonist contemplative ascetic, so I hope it reads smoothly. The correspondence is about, or the question involves that some may like to have a more explicit rule, as it were, for Platonist contemplative ascetics, or sort of a list of regulations like monastics have in other systems. Of course, the whole Platonic corpus is highly ascetic, and there's in the Phaedo there's a clear statement that also of the Philosophos, or the philosopher, will be a contemplative ascetic, having little concern with food and drink except as absolutely necessary, having no concern or at all with sexual pleasures, and having property only to the minimum extent absolutely necessary to use them, and despising any fancy things. So right there in the Phaedo you have the asceticism or monasticism of Platonism, and in other places, but a few will be mentioned explicitly here. So okay, here we go. Given here is an explicit statement of Philosophos conduct or practice that could be added to a list of such surviving explicit, quote, regulations compiled from the extant written Platonist texts, from the dialogues to the end of Platonism in antiquity, though so much appears to be lost or never committed to writing, though the Phaedo also enjoins voluntary monastic poverty, as I just pointed out, I think pretty explicitly, and it is also at least implied, if not outright stated, in the Politeia. So here is the quote, which is from the Phaedrus. It says, "O both dear Pan, and how many other gods are here, give to me to become or be beautiful or noble inside, but how much I have outside to be friendly with the things inside for me. And may I consider the wise person rich, and may the quantity of gold for me be how much no one other than the one having control over sensual desires, the sane person, would be able to bear or manage or observe." That's from the end of the Phaedrus, Phaedrus 279, B9 to C3. It's actually right at just about at the very end of it. The above is my own rendering, which may differ noticeably from other translations of the Phaedrus. That's kind of an important point. Most of the translators, if not all of the translators of the dialogues and Platonic texts, are not contemplative ascetics and renunciants and monastics, and so they would tend not to see necessarily statements of such, even if they're hit over the head with it, so to speak, or is right in front of them. So here are a few other explicit statements for a list of, for a Philosophos, quote, rule, unquote, from some surviving fragments. All of these are in my own quick, rough draft, off-the-cuff translations. From Olympiodorus's commentary on the Phaedo, and I mentioned in introducing this video that about the ascetic injunctions in the Phaedo. Of course, the Phaedo is all about asceticism and contemplative asceticism. But here's Olympiodorus's quote. Quote, "The philosopher, as far as is not absolutely necessary, looks down upon, disdains the care of the body," unquote. That's the, as they say, lemma from the Phaedo that Olympiodorus is commenting on. There are three kinds of activities, either natural and necessary, as taking nourishment and sleeping, or natural but not necessary, as sexual intercourse, or neither natural nor necessary, as finery and how many things there are of variegated clothing. There being these three kinds of activities, therefore the philosopher will have nothing at all to do with the natural but not necessary, and the neither natural nor necessary, but will thrust them away from himself, reject, despise them. And then it states parenthetically, for nocturnal emissions will suffice for him in regard to secretion of semen. But he will make use of the first, that is the natural and necessary, that is eating and drinking and sleeping, a little bit perfunctorily, pro forma, as not to take his fill or make much of them. Quote, "If then these things are thus, the philosopher, as far as not absolutely necessary, disdains the body, such a one is willing to die, the philosopher therefore practices death." So that's also Olympiodorus trying to sort of summarize the logic of the Phaedo. This is a clear and explicit statement that the Platonist Philosophos is a celibate ascetic. From Damascius's commentary on the Phaedo, the contemplative philosopher is one wanting as his goal, having been made one with the hypostases above himself, and to be theirs rather than of himself, on which account Plato says, quote, "It is not lawful for the not pure to touch the pure." That's again from the Phaedo. "It is necessary for the one being purified and hastening to be made like the pure, first to reject pleasures and pains as far as he is able. Second, he must nourish himself with plain, simple food without luxury, but also food that is righteous and temperate, that is untainted with blood and spotless, and that is wholly and in accord with ancestral practice. For the food that is unholy and harming animals and coarsening the spirit makes the body intractable to the soul and unfit for contact with God. Indeed, it's loading on so much heavy karma that any actual spiritual practice is impossible if you eat flesh. Third, he must cut off the unharmonious wrong motion of the appetitive irrationality, for what would one standing aloof from all external things desire, and with what would he be angry? But if ever such a sort of thing would be moved, either awake or asleep, it is most quickly put down by the reason. Fourth, he must keep away from all sense perceptions and imaginations as far as it is not necessary to use them. Fifth, the wanting to be released from the multiplicity of becoming is to be separated from the opinions of all various sorts. The sixth precept out of all of them is to escape the variegated complexity of thought and pursue the simpler expositions and distinctions with a view to becoming accustomed to the undivided intelligence. So this obviously is an injunction to vegetarianism. The Timaeus is explicitly vegan, that dialogue of Plato. It explicitly states that that plants are what were put there for humans to eat, and in fact, actually it says that twice, and that all so-called lower animals or other animals weren't there with the first humans, but result from the rebirths of humans that that behaved badly or unrighteously in their previous births. So, in fact, they're embodied souls that were humans at one time, and eating anything from animals is cannibalism, pure and simple, and murder and killing. And it is, like I say, explicitly vegan because it only mentions plants, and of course there couldn't have been dairy or eggs at that time since there were no other animals according to the mythos or the myth, but it has a clear statement of truth within the myth. And it follows also necessarily and logically that you can't exploit or harm these souls that used to be humans and are now conscious feeling souls in animals, as you would be if you take the calf away from the cow, the calf that it has to produce in order to give birth to in order to produce milk, and separate them and take the milk that's meant for the calves and breed chickens to lay thousands of times more eggs than they would naturally would, and suffer from that and so forth. And also the epinomis is explicitly vegan, I think. It's certainly explicitly vegetarian and says that we should be like herbivores instead of carnivores. And the explicit food that it gives is wheat and barley meal that you should eat, so that seems pretty definitely vegan to me. Okay. Of course, Porphyry tells us in the life, his life of Plotinus, the Plotinus, quote, didn't abide to take medicines made from wild animals, saying that neither did he allow foods from the bodies of domesticated animals. So clearly vegetarian, and I think also vegan. And Porphyry, of course, wrote his whole book on the necessity of vegetarianism, and with it philosophical asceticism. Though it is not directly from Platonism, but from Neo-Pythagoreanism, which is likely more derived from Platonism than from Pythagoreanism, in Philostratus's life of Apollonius of Tyana, Apollonius is given as explicitly and in detail setting forth as necessary precepts, quote, what I call the big three: celibacy in all its respects, vegetarianism, and probably veganism, including not wearing leather, etc., or wool, and teetotaling. So here's a quotation from that. For if someone has come to my standards of conduct, he would choose to get rid of all food, literally how much of a table, that is, coming from animals, and he would utterly forget wine, and not make turbid the vessel of wisdom that stands in the souls of those abstaining from wine. Neither a cloak will warm him, nor wool that has been shorn from an animal. And I give to him shoes of papyrus, and to lie down to sleep as it chances. And if I perceive him giving way to sexual desire and love, I have pits of perdition down into which righteousness, the attendant of wisdom, bears such people and thrusts them into them. That's the quotation. The I or my that's speaking in anthropomorphized form in the quotation is Philosophia herself, in his case specifically Pythagorean philosophy, Philosophia, but like as I say, that's likely really coming from Platonism. Okay, so I think probably the above examples could be expanded and multiplied many times through searching the fragmentary surviving texts, and probably there were many more such explicit prescriptions in the likely much greater bulk of Platonist literature that is lost to us. For example, because of the Muslims burning the great ancient library of Alexandria. Oh my, one of the most painful episodes you can imagine. The huge, legendary ancient library of Alexandria with so much wisdom in it, and they just came and burned the whole thing. And the Christians burning whatever may have escaped the Muslims. But just the above, with of course the Phaedo Republic and Timaeus and others, may perhaps be enough to obviate concern about any lack of structure or definite prescriptions in Platonism. It seems that the ascetic path of Platonism is pretty clear. It's just that it is left to the individual, who is one of the few, not the many, and is presumed to have some spiritual discernment himself, to work out the exact details in each particular circumstance, without, for instance, the sort of long lists of silly, absurd, and neurotic details given in, for example, the Buddhist Vinayas, and the sort of attempts criticized in the Republic, that is the Politeia, to endlessly create detailed rules for every particular circumstance to try to make up for a lack of actual righteousness, renunciation, asceticism, and spiritual discernment and informedness and intelligence, enabling the ascetic to decide more correctly what to do in each case in accordance with the actual principles of the contemplative ascetic life and practice, and the single-minded striving for release in the telos without worldly concerns and desires. So there you have some of a Philosophos rule. I might make another suggestion of a resolution to feeling a want of a set of formal precepts or regulations for Platonist contemplative ascetics, or pilosopoi. When I'm saying pilosopoi, or pilosopos, that's Greek. Pilosopos is singular, pilosopoi is plural, since the word philosopher has taken on many unfortunate connotations now that are not associated with the actual Platonist idea. In the extant text, in fact, a more really Platonist, perhaps, and ultimately more satisfactory and definitive solution is the one I might suggest. It is, though, one that is not necessarily easy to implement, and hardly anyone now could do it or even try to do it. If one can manage to clearly and fully see, so to speak, or touch or know, or come in contact with in contemplation, having ascended to the noetic realm, to the level of nous, and entering into it, the actual form or idea of contemplative ascetic in itself, or contemplative asceticism in itself, or pilosopos in itself, or Platonist renunciant yogi in itself, or etc. However one might choose to label it, just as a means of focusing on that one particular form as it truly and really and paradigmatically exists in nous. One will find that it contains in itself, is the higher source of, in unity and interpenetration with the separate forms of the individual virtues, etc., all the practices, quote, or so-called precepts, necessary prescriptions, standards of conduct, quote, regulations, unquote, etc., that we talk about. Celibacy, veganism, teetotaling, monastic poverty, abstaining from worldly entertainment, simplicity of food, drink, and clothing, world renunciation, solitude, sitting in contemplation practice, that is, formal meditation or contemplation practice for significant periods every day, the core spiritual practice of Platonist contemplative ascetics, etc., etc. All are there, though of course not in a series or list of statements, in English, obviously not in English, necessarily at the level of discursive thought, but as the actual really existing aspects of the complex level form. After thoroughly contemplating this form at the level of nous, when the soul is not even really in its sense itself, but has entered into a degree of unity with nous, when the soul returns to this level, the logoi, that's the plural of Greek logos, corresponding to or emanating from the form, will appear clearly in the soul as the statements of necessary practice or conduct at the discursive verbal level. Hard for me to put the matter into words, and a hard thing to do, but I think this is a much more ultimately satisfactory source of and point of reliance for the real thing, what constitutes ascetic practice and conduct, than feeling dependent on karmically appearing sensory experience, which is, after all, really what any text we have is. As Platonist contemplative ascetics, we have a great advantage and freedom in that our so-called regulations of renunciant ascetic conduct are eternally there and always accessible and real and unerring, and not a matter of opinion in the realm of being, in the noetic realm. And we don't have to depend on karmically chancing to encounter teachings of such in the uncertain, always changing, impermanent, only the object of opinion, not actual knowledge, sensory realm of becoming, like practitioners of other systems. And ultimately, even further, our ascesis, that's our ascetic practice, comes from the source of all knowledge, the good itself, capital G, capital itself. And direct contact and union with the good will also, even more upon the return, lead to all the logoi of the contemplative ascetic practice being present at the discursive level in the soul. All the prescriptions and ideas of ascetic practice that we read about in Platonist text and or in the text of other systems can then serve as reminders to help the soul recollect the real ascetic standards that it once knew in itself and now recontacts or remembers or learns in contemplation. Parenthetically, I mentioned that the Platonist teaching of learning being recollection solves a multitude of difficulties in the path and in this world and in thinking about things. Okay, so there you have it. I hope that has been helpful to somebody out there and of interest. There's very few of us renunciants and monastics and contemplative ascetics now. Almost really hardly any, if you think of the in proportion to the huge current population of the world, even less in an absolute sense than there were when the population was much smaller, let alone in a relative sense. We're an endangered species now, but that doesn't change at all the facts of reality, and the fact that we renunciants and contemplative ascetics are the only really sane people there are, and the only ones who actually see the situation we're in as it is, and act on that, striving to be freed from the cycle of birth and death through our contemplative ascetic practices, our renunciation, our non-harming, our contemplation, and so forth. So anyway, I hope that helps, and maybe someone watching this will be inspired or encouraged to join us and follow this eternal, always existing path themselves. It's the only way to go. Okay, thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.